Hi, folks. Steve here. Just to talk through, sort of really just give you an overview of the course Australian cinema. I'll discuss some of the key aspects that we'll be exploring in the course, some of the key questions we'll be investigating in the course, and just a general overview of the course. If you're interested in the actual the week to week content as in regard to the films that will be played and also the readings for each week. That will be in a separate lecture. You will not find that here. This is more for just a general overview of the structure of the course. Important thing to know, ladies and gentlemen, is that we are on Facebook. We do have an Australian cinema page, which is somewhat related to the course, but somewhat not. It's just got a whole bunch of people, some who have done this course before. I designed this course, I set up this Facebook group because a couple of years ago I was teaching the course and we sort of kept having these conversations about the industry and what was actually going on in the industry and things like that, and screen cultures more generally than just the films we're watching. So I designed this course thinking that a few people would join, and a lot of people have joined. A lot of students join every year, but also more importantly, a lot of industry people are part of the group. So if you are interested in the Australian cinema and sort of connecting directly with industry people, this could be a good place for you to go. It's run by me, and it's a pretty good site, I must say. So if you're on Facebook, please feel free to join, no obligation. It really has nothing to do with the course as far as, like if I change the assessment date or something, I'm not going to put it on Facebook and not sort of, tell you, right? So the course, the Facebook group really doesn't directly speak to this course, but it speaks more generally to, sort of the workings and the operations of the Australian industry. Okay, now everything you do need isn't on Facebook, it's on Blackboard, right? So just keep checking for updates and course content and things like that, which I will keep, I will keep changing and updating and things like that. The cinema course is this course really is, I'm interested in the cinema experience. Okay, so every week we're going to go essentially to the movies and we're going to watch a film together, and I'm really interested in that. I'm really interested in your general involvement in the Australian film industry, and you may think that you don't have any involvement in the Australian film industry, but you do. Every time you go to the movies and pay money, you're engaging in the Australian film industry, right? So I don't want this course just to be about Australian films that we've seen, right? It's actually about what we're all doing to be part of the Australian film culture and the Australian film experience. So really think about that when we're, across the various weeks, and also when you're doing your assessments. Now the course structure, we're going to have a 3-hour lecture and screening. It's going to be more of a screening than a lecture. But it's really important that you do come for that experience. And then that would be followed by a 2-hour tutorial. Now, ideally, we would have like the screening on one morning and then all the tutorials on that day, but that's just not going to happen. Logistically, we can't make that happen. So a lot of the tutes will be spread across the week, okay? I apologize about that, but sometimes it does give you a bit of time to actually think about the film that you've just seen, which could be good for you. Okay, so I'm sort of calling the course Exhibiting Australia, and the Australian cinema will focus on, right, the Australian film industry. And I'm interested in the Australian film industry through 3 core components: the production of the films, how the films are produced, how the films are distributed, right, how they actually get to the screen, and when they're on the screen, the exhibition. So production, distribution, exhibition. And those 3 components are really important when it comes to discussing the the industry, the national industry, and also surviving in the industry. For all of the films that we're seeing in this course, you could strongly argue, and pretty successfully argue, that all of them are kind of breakout films. They break out in a particular way. It might be breaking out in that they're launching a career of a director, or they're launching a career of a star, or they're just doing something very globally, right? So they're breaking out. They're not just sort of having local success. They're actually having international success. And I'm really interested in why some films, which do really well in Australia, like say The Dressmaker, don't do well overseas, and why they don't have that international breakout effect that other films, other smaller films, do. So I'm really interested in that question as well. I'm interested in the moments and films that have a tremendous impact and international appeal. So think about that, the moments. I'm interested in sort of what's a key moment of a film, and how do we actually create those key moments within an Australian film. So we're also looking at the concepts of national cinema, right? And think about that, national cinema in relation to the international, right? So what is an Australian film? This is a question we're going to keep coming back to week in, week out. And we're going to, what I don't want is for us to have a neat categorization of what an Australian film is. You know, Australian film is this, right? I want to muddle that. And every week I'm going to be playing you films that are really going to challenge what an Australian film actually is and what an Australian film does, right? Furthermore, to the national Australian film, what is an international Australian film? And what does that even mean? We're certainly going to be exploring that topic in great detail. And we're going to be looking at a number of readings that deal with this issue. We're also going to be looking at a number of films that deal with that issue. When we think of international Australian films, we may think of co-productions, but it's actually more than that. And I'm going to show you some local, small, independent films which are very international in aspiration and endeavour, right? Which are, is really, really interesting. So, you compare those small films to the bigger co-productions, and then suddenly you've got a very diverse, interesting, complex and complicated national industry. So outwardly Australia, this is something that we'll be exploring in more detail. It's Ben Goldsmith's somewhat seminal paper, even though it was only written in 2010, but hugely, hugely successful. And he says this: over the last 20 years or so, Australian cinema's international relations in production and policy have expanded and become more complex, while those with Hollywood have been transformed. The boundaries of the national cinema stretch much further than the national territory. Australian production and post-production companies work in Australia with international partners or on international projects. So what he's really interested in is, what is an international Australian film? How thinking of our industry through all of the different things we're doing is really important and really healthy for the industry. Right, so by only looking at films that say deal with Australian content, right, and only have Australians working in the cast and crew is actually very limiting, because it doesn't tell us everything that the industry is doing. So we have to open and diversify the way we think of the cinema and the way we look at what the cinema is actually doing. Okay. Some questions here is: what constitutes Australian cinema as both an import and export industry? Okay, so we're importing films from other countries, and we're exporting our own product to other countries. That's really important. The shooting space for local and international film productions, right? How does Australia operate as a shooting space, right? And think of all of the international film studios that we've got around the country. The Gold Coast, Melbourne, Sydney. How are they really important to actually what's going on in a thriving and surviving national industry, and actually bringing in a lot of dollars into Australia? What happens when international locations are used as Australia? Okay, so what happens in, say, a film like The Matrix, where they use Sydney as a way of sort of representing an international world, right? What does that actually do to Australia? I mean, the thing about The Matrix is interesting because you can actually see clear Sydney locations in that film. So is that film actually, if a film's shot in Australia and we can recognise it as Australia, does that somehow make the film Australian if it's just for us and nobody else? There was the Spearig brothers, who are an Australian brother team, kind of like the Coen brothers, but not as good as the Coen brothers, unfortunately. They shot a film a couple of years ago. I think it was Daybreakers. I think that was the film where they actually shot some of the film at RMIT University in building 101 or building 100, the one with the circles on the outside. And that, I'm clearly watching that as an Australian film, even though the film is set in New York. So it's really interesting what happens when international locations are used, being shot in Australia, and furthermore, what happens when Australia is used as an international location, also. Something like Mad Max is interesting. This is a film that's shot in the Southern Africa, but it's representing this futuristic, bizarro Australia. So, what happens with that? Okay, so understanding what an Australian film is and what an Australian film does. So think about that. What an Australian film is and what it does. So we're looking at definition and practice here. We're primarily interested in the process of the audience. I'm really interested in audiences, studying audiences, thinking about audiences, different sorts of audiences, whether that's audiences at film festivals, audiences at the multiplex on a Saturday night, the audiences, at those smaller kind of independent cinemas, the audience just watching movies at home, okay? You as an audience in the way that you may go to, say, the film festival, or you may pay to go and see a movie, but also through this course, we are sort of this collective audience that are going to go every week and watch a film together and discuss it together, which is a very unique experience for film watchers and film goers. So the questions: what does it mean to identify something as an Australian film? All right, so think about that. How do I identify something as an Australian film? What does it create unnecessary expectations? So if something is Australian, all right, if I said to you, okay, I'm going to play you an Australian film, are you thinking, oh, fantastic, Australian film, bring it on? Or are you thinking, oh, yeah, not really, I don't really care. I really don't care for Australian films. What are your gut responses to the national industry and the sorts of films that we produce, right? Are you excited to see Australian films? Are you not excited to see Australian films? Also, are we more critical of Australian films than, say, international films? There's a lot of crap that comes to our shores from overseas, and those films sort of come and go very quickly, and no one says much about them. But if there's a bad Australian film, golly gosh, do people just rip the film and the industry to shreds every single time? So think about that. How does one make Australian? So think about, how do we actually make a film Australian? What makes an Australian film Australian, right? How do different participants engage with Australian cinema at different levels? So, that's also part of that question there. In this course, all of the examples or case studies are reflexive in that they're kind of self-aware of their own Australianness. It's almost like they're playing on particular myths, iconographies, identities, and aspects of Australia, right? So that's, again, really interesting, the way that the films are kind of in dialogue with a broader industry. I mean, there was this whole discussion at the time of Baz Luhrmann's Australia, which was, to understand the film, you have to understand the history of Australian cinema because of what the film's actually doing, which is a valid argument because that's actually what the film is doing. But you could say that every Australian film in some way is dealing with particular myths and aspects of the history of Australia. Like even a film like The Babadook, which seems so European in its scope and endeavour, is a film that is very much tied to this thing that we call the Australian Gothic. Okay, but we'll get to that more. Okay, so the approach is studying specific films. Now, but that's only part of what we do. Okay, so we are going to look at specific films, but it's only part of what we do. The focus is to put the films that we're looking at, discussing within broader cultural, social, industrial context, right? That's really important. So we're not trying to vacuum the films. We're not trying to isolate the films. We're actually trying to say, okay, This film is part of a broader cycle. Let's talk about that cycle. Let's talk about how the film did commercially, how the film was distributed, how the film was marketed. These are the sorts of questions that I'm really interested in exploring across the course, right? So the continuing questions is what makes the film international Australian, right? So it's national, it's international, and they're sort of part of the same kind of um, you know sort of dialogue or stew or question. So we're really here. We're reading the film through the following ways: through the production, how the films are produced, distribution, right? How the film's distributed, and exhibition, how they're exhibited. And I know I've said that before, but I'm going to kind of keep pushing it at you because I'm really interested in those three components. So the important questions of the course is what is the Australian cinema? Like, what is it? What do we want and expect from it? The Australian cinema, we're talking, of course. How do we culturally and socially position it? How do we discuss it beyond the films it produces? Where and how do we watch movies? I'm really interested. If you don't go to the movies, right, let's have that conversation. If movies are just too much money, there was a recent survey that was saying that independent films aren't doing well at the cinema anymore. And my argument is, well, which I wrote on the Australian Cinema Facebook page, ladies and gentlemen, which you can read there if you join. What I said on that page was, if you're charging $25 a ticket, right, a lot of people can't justify that for a small independent film, right? What they're going to do is they're going to go to a big blockbuster, a big action, things blowing up kind of film, because that will justify their $25. The more independent films they're going to watch at home, they're going to stream and things like that. So I'm interested in those conversations. Where do we place ourselves within the national industry, right? What should the national industry do globally? And what sort of narrative conventions does an Australian feature film apply? Think about that. Are there particular like with a documentary, we know we're watching a documentary. There's things about the documentary that say to us, this is a documentary. There are things about us that will tell us this film is, say, an Irish film. What is it about Australian movie that tells us this is an Australian movie? Okay, so think about all of those things. Okay, what do we mean when we discuss and define Australian cinema? Right? Do we mean films made in Australia? Right? Is that an Australian film? Does an Australian film have to be made in Australia? Do we mean films representing Australia? Do we mean films consumed by Australians? Right? In that, Australians have to really like the film and, have to be the sort of the central generation of the generation, as in generating good interest and a sort of an event atmosphere for the film. Does Australia have to be part of that? Do we mean Australian cinema places, palaces, and houses? Right, and what I mean by Australian cinemas here. Do we mean the Australian cinema industry? Right, when we're talking about the Australian an Australian film, Australian cinema, or do we mean the Australian cinema's place within Australian society? Right, where do all of those questions play in how we understand what an Australian film is and what defines an Australian film? Okay, now I raised that to you because of that issue to you because this was a Val Morgan survey and I think they put it on the Film Victoria website. I forget exactly where I found it from, but this is what they said on the website. Right, so they asked a whole bunch of people about all of these films, and they were sort of saying, "Are these films Australian?" Right, so there were films like Avatar, Romeo and Juliet, which is Romeo plus Juliet, the Baz Luhrmann film. They were talking about Matrix, Finding Nemo, film that's kind of set in Australia, and that's interesting, that list. But what's even more interesting, perplexing, and frustrating is that what they said about it. They said many people struggle to identify Australian content correctly, right? So they were saying that those people are wrong to identify those films as Australian. But scholars like Deb Verhoeven, Tom O'Regan, Ben Goldsmith, they would argue that these films are importantly Australian in the way that we think about the national industry and the way that we engage with the national industry, right? So it is important to think about what's going on with the broader industry and kind of shame on, the sort of the judgment that the survey has on people for sort of what they said is incorrectly naming these films, where these films, they are part of the national industry. And if we're only assessing an Australian film through on-screen representation, which is, a film has to be representing Australia on screen, then I think we're in trouble. And I think we're very limited in what we can actually do. And Finding Nemo, is a fascinating one to think about as an Australian film because it's actually representing Australia, even though it's an American movie. Okay, so what the course isn't about, it's not a film history course, so it's not like every week I'm going to be looking at a different part of the history. It's not like I'm going to start at 1906 and sort of work through, over 12 weeks to get to the current state of the industry. It's not like that. A lot of the course is actually very contemporary. I'm really interested in the contemporary conversations. The course is essentially about sort of the new cinema industry, which sort of happened from the early 70s to now. But the course isn't done in any chronological order. It's purposely not in a chronological order. It's about topics, themes, cultural content, exhibition strategies, audience engagement, and how we continue to engage with particular films. Okay. The course warns about defining Australia as a national industry, and also something else. I won't be championing bad films as unsung treasures. If there's a film that plays in the course that you don't like, that's okay. It's fine to say I did not like that film and give us some reasons. All I want from you is tell me why you don't like a film and tell me why you do like a film. I want your responses, your gut responses to the film and to what is actually going on in the film and, those questions that we apply, right? Also, really importantly, each week, it's only part of the conversation, right? So some weeks, we will be talking about other films that we've seen in previous weeks or other readings we've done in previous weeks. So you need to come along every week. You need to do the readings every week to be part of actually what's going on in the course. People who really engage with the course, come every week, do the readings every week, they do end up doing a lot better with their assessments because they have a deeper understanding of the course when it actually comes time to discussing those aspects in their assessments. So please think about that. Each week falls under a broader topic, right? So the readings sometimes don't speak directly to the films that, it might be, one week it might be on distribution and it's sort of talking very generally about film distribution. And certainly we can apply the film that we're looking at within that discussion. But it's not, if we're looking at, a film like Shine, that it's going to be one article directly about just Shine. It could be about the broader issues related to a film like that. Okay. Each film works off each other in the conversation with each other. So again, it's really important that we're watching all of the films, and the films have been ordered and in a particular way, sort of being curated in a particular way, right? So it's really important that we are watching one film after another. And I kind of want, there is a jarring effect with the way that I've curated the course where I want you to watch one film and then the next week, it's almost like that film almost contradicts the film that you've seen the previous week as far as, the questions that we're asking. And I think that's really interesting. And the assessment assumes that you've seen the films and read the reading. So please make sure you keep on top of that. Okay, what we want from this course is to hear your responses to the films and readings, like I said. What do you want, expect, hope from the Australian cinema, right? So think about that, what you're trying to get from this cinema. At the end of the course, right, I think you'll have a better understanding of the national industry. You'll have a better understanding of your place in the national industry. You'll have a better understanding of Australia's place within the international film industry. And that's really what I'm just hoping for you to take. To look at Australia beyond its national borders and to appreciate the Australian cinema is to be based on those production, distribution, exhibition networks. Okay, now Elizabeth Avram said this about the national industry. With the acceleration of globalization, Australian audiences' experience of cinema as Australian has shifted beyond the textual into complex relationships between a film and its context in the entire milieu of filmmaking. So think about that. the way that we're reading films differently as Australians. And it's no longer just about hearing the Australian accent, it's actually doing other things. Right? So therefore we need to rethink how we define the Australian film and the way that we need to think how Australian film should be defined both within and outside of Australia. The problem of only Australians making Australian films, this is something that we will be discussing, right, is that everything becomes inward and not outward. It's really important that we have international people involved in making Australian films. International people think differently about the way that Australian films are made, right? And like I said here, if only Australians make Australian films, it sets up an ugly spiral. If only Australians make Australian cinema, then can only Australians understand something as Australian? And that is clearly not true. Often the films that do really well internationally, Australian films, is the way that people are reading particular myths about Australia through the cinema. And just a final thought to conclude here, the point of this course is to move from defining what an Australian film should be to understanding what Australian cinema actually does. What does Australian cinema actually do? What does an Australian film do on the screen that defines it as Australian? Speak to us as either Australian or not Australian. That's really important. And I'm not here to sort of dismiss the concept of national cinema or the national industry, but to rethink the wider ways that national cinema can be considered and globally understood. Australia is part of an international and a global network of filmmaking, and that's really important to be discussing here. All right, I'll leave it there. That's a general overview of the course. Welcome to the course. I hope you enjoy the next couple of months that we're going to have together. I'm sure you will, and look forward to seeing you soon. Bye for now.